Okay, thank you. Welcome to this seminar where we will learn more about the Union's or the European Union's responses to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. This is a seminar that is part of a project called Norway and the EU towards 2030, funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it will also be streamed online, so welcome to the online audience as well. The online audience will be can post questions on the chat if you have questions, and we will try to answer them during the seminar. So, welcome to this seminar. The focus of the seminar is the EU and EU's responses. The interesting thing is that the EU is often criticized for its slow reaction. But following the Russian invasion in February this year, the EU responded in a surprisingly swift and united manner. And in Norway, we often focus on NATO as a security actor, and NATO is, of course, there to defend Norway and other allies if needed. And together, NATO allies are boosting also their defense capabilities, as well as making sure that its deterrence is credible. But NATO as such is not really designed to respond to and to do much more than that. So the EU has in many ways, faced with this crisis, showed its importance as a regional security actor and its many instruments that it has at its disposal. Most importantly, it has adopted an unprecedented set of 8 sanction package against Russia and Russian interests. But the EU has also been an important provider of humanitarian, economic, military support, and last but not least, political support to Ukraine. And in terms of political support, giving Ukraine candidate status is, of course, key here, a decision which is historic in many ways. So to learn more about what the EU has done so far and what it all means, we are very pleased to welcome Professor Frank Hoffmeister, who currently holds the position as the Chief Legal Officer of the European External Action Service, and also is a professor as a profession as well. We are very thankful that you have agreed to come to Oslo this rainy day in November and to tell us more about the role of the EU from an insider perspective. So, with no further ado, I would just give the floor to you. Thank you.
Hello, and first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation to the Norwegian Institute for International Relations. I'm also happy to see here a colleague from the EU delegation in Oslo and many interested participants in the room, but also online. What I've been asked to talk about is the EU's response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and as I'm a lawyer by background and I'm heading the legal department, I cannot escape having a little bit of a focus on the legal matters, but I will nevertheless try to bring an overall description of the EU responses first, then come up with a legal assessment of some of the international and European law issues, and as a third point also look at the international legal institutions, in particular the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Let's start with the support side. As just outlined, the European Union surprisingly managed to come up with a very swift decision on military support to Ukraine after 24th of February. The instrument for that was pre-established. It's called the European Peace Facility. It is let's say, a box according to which the EU can provide financing to support stabilization action in third countries. It has a predecessor, this the African Peace Facility, so funding in particular EU missions in Africa, but it had been globalized, meaning it could have a reach also outside Africa. And under that European Peace Facility, there is an overall envelope for 5 years. In that extraordinary situation, it was decided to activate what has not been foreseen, namely 500 million euros to reimburse member states who are delivering weapons to Ukraine. So it is a clearinghouse at EU level. The member states say, I have delivered the following weapon to Ukraine, and then an EU check is going to be made. Does that conform to our criteria? And when the check is positive, exercised by EU military staff, then there will be reimbursement of the costs. And the first decision in that respect came 1 week after 21st of February. The first tranche of 500 million euros was accepted. And as we have seen down the road, exhausted very quickly. So the political question came, are we going to repeat this? Can we go higher with the amounts? And indeed, by now, there have been 5 consecutive decisions, each with the same amount. So currently, the EU is at 3 billion euros for reimbursement for costs of bilateral weapon delivery. To give you an idea, that would exhaust the overall financial tranche of the entire program to half. So already now it's clear that this has gone much beyond expectations at the time when the European Peace Facility was decided, and there will be talks, inevitably, whether or not to give additional resources to the EPF, also to be able to finance the other core business. Nevertheless, seen in comparison, 3 billion looks a lot, but when we know the US figure, how much is the military support of bilateral from the United States, it is more than 25. I don't know, maybe latest upgrades even more, but we are here now talking a relation 1 to 10. No? From a legal perspective, all this is also interesting because decision-making within the European Union foreign policy, as you will know, is usually done by unanimity. In this particular case, we have seen that our neutral states, Austria, Malta, Ireland, posed the question, but what does that mean for our neutrality? Can we be perceived as leaving our neutral status when we participate in such EU action? And in order to be basically sure on the legal side, these states decided to exercise constructive abstention. That is a possibility under the treaty, that you abstain in the Council voting yes, but at the same time, you do not basically prevent the EU from adopting that decision. Therefore, it's called constructive abstention, giving a basic declaration to the minutes in the Council. Why do you abstain constructively? But the Council can go ahead. This is an important political signal because constructive abstention in the common foreign and security policy had not been used in the past. As only one precedent, and that was Cyprus on Kosovo, when the EU decided its mission to basically have the rule of law mission in Kosovo, and then Cyprus used the constructive abstention. So nowadays, the European Peace Facility is therefore seen as a prime instrument on the military support side. Last month, the EU added another layer, and that is the European to Ukraine. It is the basic idea to provide structured training to Ukraine army. It has been done on bilateral level before, but now with an EU hat, there will be some sort of headquarters in neighboring countries of Ukraine, and also a common EU strategy in that effect. I will not go into the details, you will understand that, but it has also been decided in the Council by unanimity, this time Hungary using its constructive abstention. So we here see, I would say, not a trend, but at least an awareness of our member states that it's important to support unanimous decisions, and if there is some reluctance, constructive abstention is a good way forward. That brings me to my second point, macroeconomic financial support. In May, the Commission came up with a package and promised that the EU will activate additional macroeconomic finances up to 9 billion euros to be paid out in tranches over time. That is quite a Herculean task, and you can be sure that different calls from Kiev come in to Brussels regularly. Please accelerate. We need your financial support very much because the budgetary challenges are getting higher and higher by the day, and very unfortunately now with the latest attacks on civilian infrastructure and energy infrastructure, it will only become worse. So the Ukrainian financial needs are likely to grow, and I will not be surprised if there will be tough negotiations on whether that is sufficient or not. Additionally, the European Investment Bank has stepped up its support with many projects on Ukraine and has been very generous in the conditions attached to that. I will now try this little, sorry. Oops. Yes, yeah. Aha, here we are, and then I should go to the big screen again. No. Okay, can you see that? Yeah, okay, good. So then we'll go on to the humanitarian support. It has been extremely crucial in the weeks following the attacks to also activate all our humanitarian assistance. There's a specialized DG ECHO, European Office for Humanitarian Support. They have been very brave to send people on the ground to deliver assistance in kind, tents, medical support and what have you. And in the beginning it was very dangerous also to know where can you operate, near Odessa or other places. But it has been very clear that the EU also will deliver inside the country wherever possible. And importantly, when the figures became bigger and bigger on refugees, the question was what to do with those Ukrainians who will arrive in the Union. As you probably are aware, under the Geneva Convention for Refugees, 1951, there's a right to asylum if you can show that you are individually persecuted. Here, that would not be the kind of issue. Here we have a mass flight of Ukrainians who would fly from the effects of the war. So looking in an individual examination for individual persecution would simply not be appropriate. And for that kind of situation, the EU has a directive, and the directive says in the situation of a civil war or other major crisis, we can temporarily grant those refugees a special status so that they are considered refugees in the legal sense and have access to the labor market and social security. That directive has, exceptional character. But in the present case, it was also activated by a decision of the Ministers of Justice and Interior very early on, which is why today Ukrainians in the EU are treated according to high standards of protection, which was a very, very important signal despite the, I would say, overwhelming figures. You know, the numbers of Ukrainian refugees outside have gone up to 6, 7, and even more million. And in that kind of situation, to say, yes, you're welcome and we will treat you with the highest standards under temporary protection was an extremely important signal from the EU. And now I go to the fourth point, political support. As rightly mentioned in the introduction, of course, the decision on membership would not have been thinkable with all this. There were political contacts all the time with Ukraine, also at the highest level. We had, of course, an association agreement which is working. There are regular contacts, but it had been, let's say, a part and parcel of a broader neighborhood policy. After the Russian invasion, one of the key demands from the Ukraine government was, please accelerate with our membership application. We need to show to our public that there is hope for being part of the European family, and don't use your bureaucratic, it will take time. And between this kind of demand and, on the other hand, the European procedures, I would say a good compromise have been found, because the first step in any application is to decide whether or not a state may become eligible. That's a political starting point, and in this respect the Commission came up with a very quick proposal, saying there are a few conditions which need to be fulfilled, but once they are fulfilled we have absolutely no problem, and then we can go into the formal accession negotiations, and that is the granting of the candidate status. This is the political signal which could have been given early on, but it does not mean that the accession negotiations are skipped. They have to come, certainly, and the accession negotiations, there all the normal criteria will be checked. Is the country able to take over the European law, so famous acquis? What about the details of some, let's say, chapters in the political area, state of independence of judiciary? What about the situation in the criminal law, justice, and so on? There one has to look in all of these details. But the political signal that Ukraine is eligible and a candidate has been taken in summer by unanimous decision of the heads and states of the EU. So here political support also rounds up the general picture on support. And now I would like to come to my next point, which is sanctions against Russia. And that is quite a, how to say, exhaustive package. I'm going to sum up a little bit the packages one by one, just to make you aware what we are talking about. So the first package immediately, let's say before the invasion, namely on 23rd, was a response to Putin's speech that they wish to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. So we will remember that was step number one. And already that, from an EU perspective, was a blunt breach of international law. And therefore, all the members of the Russian State Duma, the parliament, who voted in favor, were put on the sanctions list. And that is quite a big step, because the sanctions list means that the properties of these persons inside the EU will be frozen. That's an important distinction. It's not expropriation in the legal sense. It means the people will not have access anymore to their accounts as long as the sanction is in place. And that is also, from a legal sense, an important kind of balance between, on the one hand, inducing the government, in this case also the Duma members, to change tack, basically saying, if you take back this vote, the freezing will be unfrozen. and on the other hand, respecting human rights, because the property is not touched as such. There were also broader economic sanctions on economic relations, in particular with goods from those areas in Donetsk and Luhansk. And already at that stage, the EU decided to restrict access to the EU's capital and financial markets, the idea being that we are not going to finance also with European capital these illegal activities. After the invasion, so 25th February, we had immediately the second package, and I should put it on screen. Yep, here we are, second package. And there the highly symbolic step was taken to freeze the assets of President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov, as well as the members of the National Security Council. On top of it, there were broad sanctions on energy, transport and technology sectors. Here the idea is also to reduce Russia's ability to have high-tech industry, and that will, as you will understand, have also an indirect military aspect. On visa policy, there is some coordination on reducing the possibility of Russian citizens to have visas in the EU if they are connected to the regime. The third package brings up a much, how to say, more broader aspect also, and that has an airspace ban on aircraft operated. So if you are a Russian air company, you will not be able to fly to Europe anymore. That is, of course, quite a drastic step. And all transactions with the Russian central bank are prohibited. So the property of the Russian central bank in the EU is also on ice currently. There are estimates who say this may be about 350 billion euros. An important novelty is the fourth point, and these are sanctions on broadcasting activities of state-owned outlets Sputnik and Russia Today. So hold your breath. Yeah, what I'm talking here is interference with media freedom. So these are entities who are financed by the Kremlin and who are having their seat in the European Union as subsidiaries, and they are broadcasting what they call news and what we assess is war propaganda. And that is quite a step. It has never happened before, and there are important questions about the competence of the EU to do so and the compliance with human rights. There is an additional novelty, that is the SWIFT bank for 7 Russian banks. SWIFT, as you are aware, is the international mechanism for making bank transfers compatible with each other. So also an attempt to undermine the possibilities of those banks to participate in international financing activities. And we go into export controls here. First step was navigation goods and radio communication. Importantly, the third package also then looks on Belarus, because Belarus is not innocent in this matter either. We have seen that the attacks were also staged from the territory of Belarus and under international law. If you look at the definition of aggression, if a state delivers its territory for the illegal aggression by another state towards Ukraine, it has some sort of complicit responsibility, and that is why already in the third package Belarus has been part of the sanctions. I come to the fourth package. Sorry, it was still here. Yeah, fourth package on the 15th. There we go into, importantly, credit rating agencies. and the prohibition of new investments in the Russian energy sector. So EU shall not invest into Russia, again with the idea to undermine the possibility to sustain the war. And there is quite an expanded list on people who are working in the Russia's defense and industrial area. So you can see it goes really more and more deeper, away from just the top level, back to more and more in the economic area. Fifth package, there is, let's put it back in our, there were the reports about atrocities in a couple of Ukrainian towns, and there the EU went into an import ban of coal. And another very important point, namely the ban of Russian vessels to EU ports. This is, I would say, fifth package here. Mind you, it's like the air transport. Now, it's not only just air, but also the shipping industry, which is targeted. They cannot have access to EU ports anymore. And legally speaking, that is an interesting point, because some of our member states do have bilateral treaties with Russia which guarantee access to their ports. So in other words, the EU is now overcoming that and saying, no, irrespective of any bilateral commitments, no Russian ship can go to any EU port anymore. There are additional import and export bans, which you can see on the screen. Well, if one has thought this is enough, no. There's a sixth package, and in the sixth package we go into an area which has been extremely debated inside the EU, and that is import ban on oil and petroleum products, because that raises the question of how does the EU try to get away from partial dependence on Russian energy, oil and gas. And here we see for the first time a very clear decision. We'll have to do it step by step. It cannot be done overnight, but the direction is clear. And this is here the first sign of it, looking at crude oil and refined petroleum products. And the media sanctions have been enlarged as well. And unfortunately, at the time in June, we were made aware of the atrocities in Bucha and Mariupol, and therefore here additional individuals were put on the list. Seventh package is a little bit less, let's say, spectacular. It is called maintenance and alignment package. Trying to roll over, and the new elements here is also dual-use goods and gold. And I come to the final one, the eighth package, which has been decided in October, and that was also politically quite debated, a price cap for Russian oil, which are maritimely transported into the EU. That also responds to an internal need, price cap, namely to stabilize the prices at home, while at the same time trying to take away income from Russia. And that goes with the remaining parts on technology and trade. So I have been a little bit exhaustive of that, also because I wanted to underline that when we talk about 8 packages, it really means a very deep and comprehensive set of sanctions which have evolved over time and which were always the result of internal discussions of how much would such sanctions be swallowable, how much can also the economies of the EU member states themselves take and endure. Because some of those goods, imports and exports, are important for the national economies as well. And therefore you need to find a balance in how far can you go. And this also explains that certain measures were not taken at the very beginning, but they have become a political option over time. and that is another reason why we have these kind of 8 successive steps. Now I would like to turn to the legal dimension and share with you some thoughts on the international law and the European human rights law aspects. So sanctions under international law are somehow a part of a broader set of rules. On the one hand, you have the rule that all states should cooperate, and they are free to choose their partners. You cannot be forced to trade with somebody or if you don't want to. On the other hand, there are rules that once you take certain commitments, in particular when you have international agreements, then you need to comply by them. Pacta sunt servanda. And in that respect, some of the measures of the EU have to be screened and have to be also looked at. Is that in line with existing commitments that have been taken prior to the sanctions? And that is an important aspect, because we do have legal commitments with Russia. On the one hand, there is a partnership and cooperation agreement, the PCA. And on the other hand, there are multilateral commitments like the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And as I've just mentioned, there may be also bilateral commitments by some member states with Russia. So how does that all fit together? And here the reply can be very brief. I don't want to annoy too much with that, but on the trade field, there is an exception built in all those texts. So both in the PCA with Russia and in the GATT, there is a clause saying you are allowed to suspend trade concessions if it concerns essential security interests. That's the so-called national security exception. And in this case, there is a very clear view that the clause is applicable. It is in the essential security interests of the EU not to continue trade with Russia, and that has been accepted previously by the court in a case of Rosneft related to Crimea sanctions. And in the GATT itself, there is a declaration of more than 20 states who point to Article 21 of the GATT in the current situation and say, we believe essential security interests are at stake, and that is why we take those sanctions. And Russia has not contested that. They do contest a lot, but that not. So on the trade field, there is an inbuilt justification in the trade texts. When we go to the other bilateral commitments which are at stake, situation may not be so clear-cut, and that is in particular for air transport and access to port situations, because there are ICAO commitments, International Convention on Air in Montreal, and on the other hand, bilateral member state commitments on maritime transport. So if you don't have an essential security exception in these texts, where is your justification for suspending such obligations? And here the underlying reasoning is, well, under general international law, it is possible to take countermeasures against a wrongdoing of another state. So in other words, if somebody attacks you, you can defend yourself against the attack. Here, the situation is a little bit more complicated because Russia did not attack the EU, but attacked Ukraine. So how is the EU as a third party affected by the Russian aggression against Ukraine? And the answer to that question is yes, the EU is affected because the prohibition on employing force, so the breach of that prohibition concerns the international community as a whole. We lawyers call this in a nice Latin verb, It's an erga omnes obligation, erga omnes, owed to the entire international community. So when Ukraine becomes a victim of aggression, it concerns the entire world, and therefore also the entire world is allowed to take countermeasures against Russia. That is an international law concept which is developed. It is not uncontroversial, but we are clearly taking the view that this is possible to rely on countermeasures as a third party in this situation, in particular because the General Assembly of the United Nations has left no doubt that there is an aggression. It's not basically a self-arrogation to say we believe this is wrong and therefore we can react. No, it's the UN General Assembly has said this is a clear-cut aggression, and therefore the EU puts itself towards the enforcement of the prohibition on the use of force. So that is an interesting point, which certainly will be discussed later on in the specialized circles. On European human rights, I already mentioned two issues. The one is the right to property, and the other one is the free speech and media freedom. On the right to property, we believe that the sanctions are justified because the freezing is not an expropriation, and the European Court of Justice has accepted that line of reasoning since a long time. And on the media freedom, that is the new dimension here, the prohibition to broadcast war propaganda was looked at by the General Court of the EU in an expedited procedure, very, very quick. In 3 months, the court decided. And it really outlined that yes, it's an interference with the media, but it is justified because the broadcasting entities we are talking about themselves do not live up to their duty to spread impartial and duly investigated information. So there is a clear line between what a media broadcaster can do and what they cannot do is to spread war propaganda based on alleged facts which have nothing to do with the reality. So there is a court judgment on that, looking at the restrictions on the and the justifications to interfere with the broadcasting rights under European Human Rights Law, Article 11 of the Charter on the Human Rights in the European Union. And that leads me to my third point, political isolation. On top of it, the EU has very much supported that in UN fora Russia will be isolated. You know, Russia was evicted from the Human Rights Council of the UN with very much EU activity behind it. It has been put out of the Council of Europe. There are other examples. It's very clear that here the EU will always comply with the procedural rules applicable. So in the UN or in the Council of Europe, we will make sure if there is a mechanism whereby a member can be suspended or even evicted, then we will follow the books, not just say, okay, we don't want them anymore, and we will then boycott meetings. No, no, no. They will be following the books according to the procedural rules. And therefore, I come to my last point, international justice. That's an area which does not write big headlines, but we believe is quite important. And the first is the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. And here, Ukraine has brought a case against Russia. A case, and you can ask yourself under which legal basis, because the International Court of Justice does not have compulsory jurisdiction. It is not competent to rule on all matters of international law. It can only look at cases where there is a specific jurisdictional clause, a specific consent of both states to the dispute, that the ICJ can look at it. It's a little bit archaic, but this is what the current system is. You need to consent to the jurisdiction of the ICJ before the court can become active in a case between the two sides. So where is the consent of Russia that the ICJ can look at case of aggression? Where is it? And the answer is, well, it's not that simple. There is no general jurisdiction on questions of prohibition on force, yes. But Ukraine and Russia have both ratified the UN Convention on the Suppression and Prevention of Genocide. And that is important because one of the reasons for the invasion in Putin's speech was there is an ongoing genocide in Ukraine which we will have to stop. We, of course, believe this has absolutely no factual basis, but nevertheless, the allegation was made, and Ukraine said, okay, interesting. So Russian Federation believes we have failed with our obligation to suppress genocide. And that is a dispute between Russia and Ukraine about the existence or not of genocide in those areas. So Ukraine brought a case on the basis of Article 9 of the Genocide Convention. And as you will see, this is of course a new legal question. It has never been done like this before. And what the EU member states decided is we are going to support the legal reasoning of Ukraine by making formal interventions in the ICJ. That is possible under Article 63 of the statute, giving our legal view of how this jurisdictional clause, Article 9, shall be interpreted. And to date, we have 18 member states who have intervened, 18, 1-8, which is unprecedented. If you look at the whole history of the International Court of Justice, there were at most 2 or 3 interventions in the pending case. Now we have 18, plus United States, United Kingdom, New Zealand. So it's really the case before the ICJ now in terms of interventions. And all of the interveners support the Ukraine legal reasoning. We will see what the court will do with it. Russia has objected to it and thought this is inadmissible, this is a political move, but certainly not, because all the interventions are based on very proper legal reasoning, and the reasoning is coordinated within the EU legal working group. On top of it, the EU itself, as an international organization, has submitted information relevant to the case to the ICJ, which is a different step. It's not a legal interpretation of the Genocide Convention, but it is more factual information relating to the situation in Donbass. I turn to the other main player here. It's the International Criminal Court, the ICC in The Hague. It is an international court which has been founded in 1998 by a treaty, multilateral treaty, between over 120 states. And the ICC is responsible and competent to look at the individual criminal responsibility. So if a Russian commander orders a war crime, the shelling of a civilian target, he will be individually criminally liable. And the International Criminal Court can investigate and put him to trial for that. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide if the legal qualifications would be met by Russian action in Ukraine. However, the court will not start a case just like this. The individual prosecutor will have to take a decision And in this case, the decision was based on a referral by 39 ICC states, among them all 27 EU member states, who asked the ICC prosecutor, you now have to start investigating Russian war crimes in Ukraine. That is a possibility under the statute. It was activated with an overall support, and that means that now the prosecutor is active on the ground. The EU has also given additional financial support to the court, 7.25 million, and there are joint investigation teams of different member states. 6 member states have pulled their national prosecutors together on the basis of what we call universal criminal jurisdiction. So also on the investigation on Russian war crimes, there's a lot of activity ongoing right now. And that brings me to the last point, accountability mechanisms, support for Ukraine criminal justice system. The EU also gives a lot of additional advice to the Ukraine prosecutor. We deliver also sophisticated material for recording witness statements. Eurojust has a database now to collect all the relevant evidence, and so on and so on. There is an advisory mission on the ground which also helps the judicial system. So that is, how to say, on top of the international efforts, it's support of the national efforts. And there is an atrocity crimes advisory group with the United States and others who politically try to steer the interaction between national and international investigations on those areas. So, ladies and gentlemen, I come to my conclusion. I think I stayed within the time allotted to me. So the EU responses themselves can be considered as unprecedented in terms of speed and depth. And the unanimity in the EU member states, 27 governments needing to agree, has been kept by, in particular, constructive abstention in the military field. The legal assessment shows us that the law here serves both as an enabling and a constraining factor. So the sanctions are far-reaching, but the legal constraints on expropriation and free speech make sure that they are temporary in nature. Yeah? Also, the broadcasting ban has been enacted for 3 months and will be prolonged for another time, but temporary in nature. And on the role of international legal institutions, I think it has become clear that the EU has supported the International Court of Justice and the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and that, from our perspective, is very important for countering the Russian narratives with facts and findings of the highest international legitimacy. I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to look forward for discussion now.
Okay, I can just move this a little bit. Okay, thank you so much for this presentation. It was very good to have this overview of all the things that the EU has done. Especially, we all know the kind of the headlines, the 8 packages, but to know exactly what that actually entails is very, very useful. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, so I tend to, when I hear what the EU is doing, I'm always thinking about, well, what is the kind of the legal side of it, and what is the political side of it? And you mentioned that a little bit, but I would like to ask you one first question, and then of course feel free to sign up while I'm asking this first question, because I mean in this crisis the EU as a security actor has been more visible, but the question is this? I mean, you said that constructive abstention is a new, would have used this in order to come to terms with the unanimity challenge. But at the same time, I just wonder how much is new, and how much is it that the EU actually is now showing the instrument that is actually kind of the capacities that the EU has in this area. So that is the first question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Indeed, the political arena has, how to say, come to, I would say, a silent understanding. It's always good to look at an EU joint response, always, in this crisis. That's why there is so much coordination ongoing, and that whenever there's talk about new sanctions, there is no way around Brussels. That's clearly an understanding of our governments to come to the table, because as a EU response, it simply has more credibility and impact. So that's the starting point. And then the second question is, do the instruments that we have in the legal terms actually suffice? Are they broad enough? And here there may be some discoveries. So the European Peace Facility was a discovery. And there is also some progressive interpretation of the powers. So under Article 215 of the Treaty on Sanctions, it has very broad language, the necessary measures, yeah, necessary. Yeah? And then the question comes up: okay, does that include the power to enact a broadcasting ban? We have not done it before, and the reply to it is yes, because war propaganda is an important novel instrument also in influencing the European public, and we cannot simply accept that. And therefore, if you want to have an effective and centralized reaction, you should do it via an EU means. And because it is new, then it may also be challenged. And in the case I have mentioned, the Russia Today France versus Council case on broadcasting, the applicant, so Russia Today France, brought this up and said, well, the EU doesn't have the power for that. Yeah, it's wrong on substance, but in the first place, it lacks the power. But the court looked at it and says, no, for the maintenance of security and peace, the fighting of war propaganda is important and part and parcel of what can be a sanction. So I think the answer is, politically, there is a predisposition to use what we have, but how far the legal side reaches is a little bit subject to progressive interpretation.
Arne, you had a question?
Okay. Yes, I'm Arne Melchior from NUPI, not a lawyer either, an economist, but I have some familiarity with trade law. So you referred to expropriation and media issues in terms of temporariness of sanctions. So my question is, should economic sanctions in general also have a kind of temporary nature? One is the legal side of it, that some of the carve-out clauses, for example, in the GATT, have language suggesting they should be temporary in a way. Second is the political, about there being a way out. And the third is the pragmatic argument of having smart sanctions that last very long, which create a very complex international system. So should also economic sanctions have a kind of temporary motivation?
Yeah, thank you. I would say one has to look at the case which we are applying, economic sanctions. In general, the idea is you impose also on economic sanctions in order to change the behavior of the one who is sanctioned. So that is, in theory, the justification to say, okay, if then the person will comply, then there is no need to continue those sanctions. Best example is Myanmar. We had for a long time economic sanctions against Myanmar. Once the military junta had allowed Suu Kyi to come back, this could be lifted. Now, unfortunately, the thing has been reversed, but still that was the logic also for broad economic sanctions against the country as such. So therefore I agree with you that this should be an important consideration. On the other hand, there are situations where you probably know already today that temporary can be very long. So it's not an economic sanction, but it's a good example. We have an arms embargo against China. I don't expect that to be lifted anytime soon. So there, the idea about temporary is purely theoretical. So there may be situations where indeed you will have to say there is a fundamental disagreement about a certain point, and therefore we cannot have this kind of cooperation with that kind of regime. But in general, I would agree with you, temporary should be an important part of any economic sanction, especially those which are designed to, how to say, influence the behavior of a government.
Yeah, I'll just add to that before I give you the floor. It's also, I mean, there's a lot of literature on sanction and their effects, and it's a bit disputed how effective or what kind of effect it has. And of course, it's very important to send a signal towards Russia, of course, that this aggression is not acceptable. But for now, we do not really see any change in Russian government. So this is very much a long-term policy. Of course, it's not less important for that matter, but that links to the temporary, the thing to have it kind of a temporary dimension to it. So how is that seen from the EU perspective?
To look at the effectiveness, I think we have now half a year. There are some studies about that already. Clearly, the ruble is still in somewhat of a stable phase, but the possibility of Russia to source its own industry has become very, how to say, under pressure. We know that for sure, but the Russian official documents will not talk about it. And I'm not saying that there are, how to say, false books on the statistics, but you can have a certain doubt in some of the official statements that we receive from there. Second, and from a political perspective, whenever there are talks about Russian cooperation needed, for example, on the export of Ukrainian wheat, behind the scenes, if some interlocutors may mention the need to lift the EU sanctions. So if they are so ineffective, why would the Russian government care to make this a condition in political negotiations? So that is also an important point. And that's not only on those points. You will certainly see a request, if ever there is a peace treaty, to which terms and on which phase, whatever, this will be an important question on the table as well.
Okay.
My name is Kjell Stamnes. Thank you for a good and informative presentation. The first question is regarding the humanitarian part of your presentation. You said that there was a decision to accept protection for all people coming from Ukraine and not on an individual basis. And you gave also a justification of that. But why wasn't that same rule used regarding Syrians coming to Europe? That was the first question. Second question is about the International Criminal Court. What is the role of Russia versus that court? Has it been accepted by Russians? And what can the possible consequences of a verdict be?
Yeah, thank you. On the first question, why has it not been used in the case of Syria? I'm not aware of all the details, but I think there was some sort of a fear that the persons who will come to the EU may not be properly identified as Syrians only. So that gives you a little bit the hint. So we have seen over the conflict that many people came, which probably came from Afghanistan, and would simply say, "I'm Syrian refugee," and so on. So there is a doubt on this, and maybe second is a purely political point. You need also for this consensus inside the EU governments, and if they cannot come to terms on that, you will not have the possibility to trigger the same. On the second question, International Criminal Court, Russia has not accepted it. It's not a party to the ICC, but according to the rules of the International Criminal Court, you can prosecute the crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine, because Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction by separate declarations. So the legal basis is whatever crime in Ukraine territory is committed by Russian soldiers, the ICC is competent. And that is also meaning that if ever there would be a trial in The Hague against Russian perpetrators, they have no chance to deny the jurisdiction of the ICC.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Kasper Szulecki. I'm a researcher here at NUPI. I have a question regarding, the movement of Russian citizens in Europe. Some member states which are bordering Russia have already from the start introduced certain hurdles for Russian citizens to enter. That was first regarding visa procedures, and lately Poland and the Baltic states have been quite explicit about the denial of entry for Russian citizens. This, as far as I have heard at least, can be considered illegal from EU law perspective. So what is your view on this? Because Finland, for instance, has not introduced any such measures. So should the EU introduce similar bans, which are of course justified from a national security perspective? And if not, if this is really illegal, should those EU members be persuaded to lift those bans?
Yeah, thank you very much. The question has been discussed in the Foreign Affairs Council in, if I'm not mistaken, in September. And the outcome was there will be a joint EU reply by suspending the visa facilitation agreement with Russia, and that has been done. In other words, pre-war conditions for certain groups of Russian citizens to have visa quickly and with less administrative fees have been completely taken away. At the same time, the decision on individual visa requests remains an issue of each member state to decide, and the Commission can only issue guidance. So in other words, what the Baltic states have done is not illegal, and what Finland has done is not illegal either. It's national discretion to decide how strict they want to be. But the Commission can give guidance, in particular when a state wishes to completely shut down visa delivery. What are the elements required to do so?
We have another question over here.
Thank you for a very clear and systematic presentation. It was very interesting and very clarifying. My name is Ivar Dale. I'm from the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. And I have two questions. Are we reaching a point where we're running out of things to put in the sanctions packages? Is there, what's in the 9th and the 10th and the 11th one? Have we exhausted it, or is there, what more is there? Are there more serious sanctions to come? And the second one is about the role of Russia's strategic partners in South Caucasus and Central Asia. Of course, they've been good at declining to recognize these people's republics. They've not sent soldiers to help in the war. They voted, they abstained in the UN and so on in votes. At the same time, you see, there's a lot of Russian businesses are reestablishing themselves in Georgia, bank accounts and so on being opened. In Moscow, you'll see Coca-Cola from Kyrgyzstan on the markets. You have, rumors of this. There's an Iranian drone factory in Tajikistan. Is that supplying anything to Russia? At what point are these countries getting into the danger zone of becoming victims of, or being sanctioned themselves for helping out Russia? Thanks.
Yeah. 9th and 10th package. I'm not going to speculate about it, but I can, of course, mention that already in the past, some ideas have been tabled and were voted down because one or the other member states would not go along with it. A particular difficult topic is not oil but gas. Given the dependence of some member states to a very high degree of Russian gas. But there is a strategy laid down by DG Energy to also reduce dependency on that and also to, get forward with the mutual solidarity within the EU on energy transport and supply. So I would not exclude at some stage that this may also be on the table. One sanction, which is more of a symbolic nature, which had not found unanimity, was whether to put the head of the Russian Orthodox Church on the list. I'll leave it to your assessment how effective that is, but still. And the question of third country allies' support of Russia, this is a very much moving target. We have seen very recently the EU has put new sanctions on Iran, and not just because of domestic behavior. So I think the delivery of drones to the Russian military is a point where the EU would say this is a no-go. At the same time, the Central Asian republics, one needs to have a little bit of understanding for them and cannot expect the moon. I mean, if you make an open opposition to Russia now, it's probably a big ask. And to, let's say, come up with a sanction for a government which is trying to find a middle ground is maybe also not very cute in political terms. But on the other hand, Belarus, as I've already mentioned, and if the situation would become worse in military terms, I would not be surprised that Belarus also will be sanctioned more than before.
Okay. Yeah, Christoph. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank, for as always a very insightful presentation. I'm Christophe Fillion from NUPI and the law faculty here in Oslo. A couple of legal questions, I'm afraid. Some very, very specific, and perhaps another one a bit broader. First, why is the partnership and cooperation agreement still in force? You mentioned one particular clause. There is another one in that partnership agreement, which is the essential element clause, which allows the parties, one of the parties to suspend the overall agreement in a sort of accelerated fashion in case the other party infringes some fundamental principles which have to do with democracy, fundamental rights protection, and the rule of law. Why have these elements not been invoked just to suspend the agreement? A second question, which you have not touched upon, which seems to be at the heart of the sanction strategy of the EU, and that is avoiding circumvention of the sanctions. There are many ways circumvention can arise. I was in a member state of the Union recently at the airport, where I saw lots of planes coming from Armenia, which did not seem to fly Armenian passengers. So there are ways to circumvent the sanctions of the Union. I'm wondering what kind of tools the EU has at its disposal to prevent circumvention inside, but also outside, particularly in relation to countries which are very integrated with the EU and which are not necessarily following scrupulously the sanction regime of the EU. And my last point, which is related to that, the EU strategy is working so far. Member states have been behind, and the worst case scenario, abstention has been used not to prevent the Union from acting, but it seems to me quite precarious. How long is this? How much or how sustainable is this? What if one member state or a couple of member states become a little bit more difficult? I have a couple of member states in mind, but I will refrain from naming them. How is it likely to continue for the Union to take stricter and stricter sanctions if you have internally some member states which do not necessarily want the EU to be more active? Thank you.
Yeah, on the first question, I agree with your legal assessment, which is that the EU is entitled to invoke a breach of essential elements of the PCA with Russia. It is a political choice to activate that clause, and I will go as far as saying that the option is examined. On your second issue, circumvention, I'm afraid that from a strictly international law point of view, it's not a circumvention if Armenia continues to allow air transport by Russian citizens. It's a sovereign right of every state to align itself to the sanction or not. And if the state decides it's not going to align itself and simply exercises the freedoms under the ICAO Convention, there's nothing you can do legally. You cannot even say this is circumvention. It is more a political issue to say, can we try to convince more and more states to align, in particular those who are close to the Union. We are doing so with the Western Balkan states, who are candidate countries. Switzerland has gone a long way, surprisingly, also on the financial sanctions. But you cannot expect all third countries to follow all the aid packages. And I think probably the most prominent case of not doing so is Turkey, because Turkey has clearly said from the very beginning, we are not going to follow suit inter alia, because we want to keep a possibility to mediate between the two sides, which has been fruitful for the grain export. And Turkey has also taken a responsible decision on closing the Black Sea route under the Montreux Convention of 1936. So I think there are many elements which you will have to consider. But I would refrain of calling this circumvention. And the third point, how long is the precarious situation? Well, I'm afraid there is no good answer here. I personally am convinced that the aid packages show that when it really comes to making decisions, also the hesitant member states are joining in. But inter alia, because there are bona fide efforts before to reduce the scope of the sanctions to take into account national sensitivities. So when you go into the details of some of those economic sanctions, you can see that certain positions of some member states are taken on board by carve-outs, exceptions, temporary rules as of when the sanction applies and so on. I will not going to go into detail, but that's an essential element in the EU. You discuss very intensively the scope and try to take on board so that in the end all member states can join.
I just want to add on that more from a political science perspective, because there is this balance between that I started out with, between the legal kind of structures and the political. So for how long can the EU, I mean, if this war will kind of maintain for a long time, how long can we expect to have unity? You see that we have seen unity now for the 8 packages, and it has been surprising, and it also is some kind of discipline in the European Union, and it's difficult to not to agree on these sanctions. But if this will last for long, there is a. So what is the balance when you look at the EU as a security actor? I'm looking at it in a different, because I'm not looking at all these legal things, which are of course the backbone and important. But how robust is that system if there is not political will?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if the political will is fading, we will face maybe a situation of an impasse. I mean, there is also public perception in some member states. Citizens will ask, why do you give more money to Ukraine than to us? My energy bill is doubled or tripled or 5 times as high, and you only care for them and not for us. I mean, this will inevitably influence the politics on this, and at some stage, maybe governments will have to accept that there are limits of what you can do. I do reckon that. But on the other hand, I again underline that all member states have a basic understanding that acting together is by far the better option. Than vetoing or torpedoing EU action, and then at the end of the day, then maybe some will go ahead bilateral, and others will not do it, but look, I would say, responsible, and will have to take the political consequences of that. And that is not an attractive option. And it's not an attractive option, in particular, if your ultimate game is to have an impact on Russia.
How important do you think that initiatives such as European Political Community and other kind of instruments to try to, because this could be seen as an arena to kind of build this unity that you actually need, and also coalitions with partners that are not part of the European Union?
Yeah, thank you. You asked a very important point. So, of course, I'm an EU official. I will always talk about the EU 27, yeah, sure. But Europe is much larger, including a very important host country of this event. So what are the political tools to give even a greater unity? Is the political European community a good idea? And I think yes. Talking about foreign policy issues in a structured way on a regular basis at a high level will help also the understanding between non-European Union states, what the EU is doing, and also the EU to understand better what are the sensitivities of our neighbors and other partners. And therefore, I'm a fan of this idea. The first meeting in Prague gave a good starting point, and needs to go on. And the possibility to have even let's say a broader-based unity to face the Russian aggression is something which we would welcome.
Interesting. We have two questions over here. You first.
I'm Yuni. I'm from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I have a question with regards to the potential humanitarian assistance exceptions to the sanctions. I know that the UN Security Council is working on a draft general carve-out exceptions to their sanctions. And I was wondering if there's a similar framework in your sanctions package, or how would such a resolution from the Security Council affect your sanctions? Thank you.
We do have humanitarian exceptions in our sanctions package. And if there would be a conflict with a UN-based general scheme, under our legal system, international law takes precedence. So it would mean we could interpret our exceptions in light of what comes from the UN. I'm not aware now of an existing divergence, because I understand that there's work in progress, but certainly the EU would align to an international regime on the matter.
We have a second question.
Thank you. Marcus Lorentzen, also from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You mentioned earlier, and you touched upon it a little bit just now as well, but regarding the joint response of the European nations in general, because I believe it's important that all nations of Europe kind of act in concert on this. As you are probably aware, Norway has adopted most of the EU sanctions, but we have also allowed certain national adjustments, to put it like that. You mentioned the broadcasting ban. Norway has not adopted that yet. And also, when it comes to access to ports, we have also some smaller adjustments. And I was wondering if you could maybe draw a little bit on your experience from the European Union on how is the attitude in the European Union when it comes to the Norwegian stand on this? Is it discussed? Are we too small and we only care about ourselves? Or are we showing sufficient solidarity? And of course, another side to this question, of course, is Norway as a war profiteur. Yeah, if you could elaborate on that, please. Thanks.
You don't have to be diplomatic now.
Well, I do reckon that this is a public debate which is also broadcast, and I will put it this way. From a Brussels point of view, every alignment is positive, and the more it is complete, the better. But as I said in my previous reply, there's also some understanding for national sensitivities, given the particular role of certain countries' history or the neighborhood or its foreign policy attitude in general. And if Norway decides that broadcasting ban is let's say, for us Norwegians, not appropriate because we value media freedom even higher than the Europeans, or we are not fully convinced that this is all the time war propaganda, for whatever reason, this is a legitimate decision of the Norwegian government to assess the instrument. At the same time, the EU will stick to its approach to say we think it's warranted, and if you read the judgment of the General Court of end of July, you will find maybe some reassurance that it is indeed compatible with human rights, and very much so. So maybe after half a year you can revisit that in view of such new evidence. On the question of a profiteur, I think that goes much beyond my expertise. I mean, the world markets on gas and the price evolution is certainly market-based, and if a major producer can earn from that, I don't think, legally speaking, I would put this as a responsibility of Norway.
This perhaps goes beyond the legal,
yeah.
but you do not have to comment on that. Are there other questions before we just have a few minutes before we need to end? So there is possibilities for a final question. No? Thank you so much. This was very useful to have the whole picture of what the EU is doing, and also come into some of the debate on the political side, even though...
and has there been a question from internet?
Oh yeah, maybe, no? Comments? Yeah, we don't have to have the Russian comments. Okay, thank you so much, and thanks to all for coming, and thanks to all for joining us online.
Thank you.
Thank you.